In the shadows of antiquity, among forgotten temples and myths smothered by time, emerged stories of cults that were not merely expressions of faith but also of excess. Forbidden pleasures and mysteries that blurred the line between religion and madness. One such cult, nearly erased from collective memory, was responsible for transforming celebrations into nightmares, leaving behind a legacy so disturbing that even centuries later, it unsettles those who dare to study it. The origins of this cult remain shrouded in legend. No official texts describe its practices, because much of what we know comes from fragmented testimonies written by chroniclers who already viewed it with suspicion. What can be pieced together is that it began as a seemingly harmless religious movement. It's devoted to the celebration of fertility, abundance, and communion with the forces of nature. Its rituals took place in forests, caves, and hidden halls, far from the eyes of established order. It was a cult that promised spiritual liberation, but quickly descended into indulgence and violence. At first, it resembled countless other pagan devotions to the cycles of life. Wine symbolized communion with the divine. Music created an atmosphere of ecstasy, and bodies moving in frenzied dances represented the soul's surrender to the transcendent. But what began as a celebration of life soon came to be known as a path of ruin. The boundaries between sacred and profane disappeared. The cult preached that to unite with the gods, one had to abandon all human limits, all control, all inhibition. It was here that devotion blurred into unrestrained pleasure. Endless banquets were held in the name of the gods, but these feasts were not simple meals. They became true rituals of excess, where eating and drinking to exhaustion symbolized breaking mortal boundaries. Collective ecstasy created an atmosphere where reason was lost, and darker instincts surged. Chroniclers describe that participants often left these rites deranged, as if touched not by something divine, but by something profoundly disturbing. Secrecy was essential to the cult. Only initiates could participate. An initiation involved tests of physical and emotional endurance that pushed the limits of human capacity. There were oaths of silence and absolute loyalty, with death as the penalty for those who dared reveal the secrets. This aura of mystery attracted more and more followers, many fascinated by the promise of breaking free from social restraints, plunging into experiences that mixed pleasure, fear, and devotion. It did not take long for authorities to grow suspicious. When rumors of orgies, hallucinations, and acts of cruelty began to spread, the cult ceased to be a mere religious curiosity and became a threat. What alarmed leaders was not only the excess, but the fact that under the veil of the sacred, all moral and social boundaries dissolved. Established order depended on discipline and hierarchy, but within this cult, dissolution reigned. Accounts claim that during the rituals, participants believed themselves possessed by the very deities they worshipped. In this state, they committed acts that in any other context would have been unthinkable. It was the fusion of the sacred and the grotesque. Wine, mixed with herbs and hallucinogenic substances, drove the participants into altered states of consciousness where they lost all grasp of reality. The feast promised as liberation became a collective nightmare. This explains why the cult was persecuted, condemned, and eventually erased from official memory. It was not merely a different religion, it was a challenge to order, an inversion of values, a threat to political and religious power. The cult revealed an uncomfortable truth. When devotion abandons all boundaries, it can transform into something indistinguishable from madness. The mysterious origins of this cult, therefore, are not just a curious footnote of history. They mark the beginning of a trajectory in which celebrations meant to be moments of unity and joy turned into feasts of horror and collective nightmares. In their attempt to merge faith with absolute pleasure, the followers opened the doors to something far darker, the transformation of celebration into ritual, and of ritual into tragedy. Feasting has always carried a dual meaning in human history. On the surface, it is about abundance, generosity, and the joy of sharing food and drink. But beneath the surface, a banquet can reveal power, excess, and sometimes corruption. To outsiders, it might have looked like celebration. Inside the circle of initiates, however, it was a sacred performance designed to dissolve boundaries and immerse participants in something both intoxicating and terrifying. At first glance, the cult's gatherings resembled grand feasts familiar to ancient societies. Long wooden tables were lined with roasted meats, bowls of fruits, pitchers of wine. Torches flickered in cavernous halls or forest clearings. Music echoed through the chambers, with drums, flutes, and chants rising together until the line between rhythm and heartbeat blurred. For those who stumbled upon such scenes, it may have seemed like a night of revelry, a simple excess of pleasure. But to those within, the feast was an initiation into a deeper, darker communion. The banquet was carefully orchestrated. Every dish, every vessel of drink carried symbolic meaning. Meat symbolized the strength of the divine, wine represented both blood and ecstasy, and bread became the emblem of shared existence. They descended into excess, encouraging participants to consume beyond reason, to gorge themselves, as if the act of losing control was itself a holy offering. Gluttony was reframed as worship, indulgence as transcendence. The drinking rituals were particularly dangerous. Wine was consumed in staggering quantities, often mixed with herbs or mind-altering substances that amplified hallucinations and distorted perception. As cups were drained and refilled endlessly, the atmosphere shifted. The line between banquet and ritual blurred. The intoxicated crowd fell into frenzy, chanting and singing, bodies swaying to rhythms that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Chroniclers who described these rites insisted that participants appeared possessed, their eyes glassy, their voices trembling as if otherworldly forces had taken hold. This frenzy was not accidental. It was the intended climax of the feast. The leaders of the cult believed that only by stripping away rational thought could the divine truly enter the human body. Overindulgence in food and drink became the path to spiritual possession. But as with all things born of excess, what was promised as transcendence often became torment. Accounts of these gatherings describe scenes that resembled nightmares rather than celebrations. Bodies collapsed from overindulgence, trembling in fits of intoxication. Others screamed or laughed uncontrollably, their senses broken by the substances coursing through their veins. And through it all, the feast continued, as if no amount of suffering could interrupt the ritual's flow. The night stretched on, and what began as celebration became chaos. What made these banquets particularly alarming to outsiders was the secrecy surrounding them. They were not public festivals where the entire community joined in. They were hidden rites, invitation-only ceremonies for initiates bound by oaths of silence. The secrecy fed suspicion, and the excess fueled rumors. Stories spread of orgiastic madness, of blood spilled among the wine, of sacrifices disguised as celebration. Whether these rumors were exaggerations or accurate descriptions is difficult to say, but the fact remains that the cult's banquets blurred every boundary between feast and ritual, pleasure and pain, devotion and delirium. The banquet also functioned as a tool of hierarchy. New initiates were tested during these gatherings, urged to consume more food, more drink, to endure the madness longer than their peers. The ability to lose control was paradoxically seen as a measure of devotion and strength. Those who faltered too soon were mocked or excluded. Those who endured the longest, surrendering themselves completely to the frenzy, were celebrated as chosen by the gods. Thus the banquet was both a rite of inclusion and a mechanism of control, ensuring loyalty to the cult and deepening its hold on every participant. Authorities of the time quickly came to fear these hidden feasts. They saw in them not only indulgence but rebellion. Banquets by nature were communal, and communities are powerful. To gather in secret, to eat and drink beyond reason, to dissolve into a shared frenzy. This was more than devotion. It was a threat to the order of society. Discipline, restraint, and hierarchy held communities together, but within these feasts, those very foundations crumbled. The cult replaced the order of the state with the chaos of the table, where divine possession excused all acts. The darker side of these rituals is reflected in accounts of what happened when the frenzy reached its peak. Some describe violence breaking out, acts of cruelty committed under the belief that the gods demanded offerings. Others speak of participants so intoxicated that they harmed themselves or collapsed lifeless among the tables. Whether or not every detail is true, the pattern is clear. The banquet was not meant to end in peace. It was designed to strip humanity bare, to turn joy into delirium, to test the limits of body and mind until they shattered. Looking back, these forbidden banquets reveal the paradox at the heart of the cult. What appeared as celebration was in fact destruction. What promised unity ended in chaos. What was framed as communion with the divine often left participants broken, terrified, or degraded. The feast, meant to be a symbol of life, became a rehearsal of death. And it is for this reason that these gatherings remain etched in history, not as joyous celebrations, but as nightmares disguised as rituals. To outsiders, the cult's banquets were shocking because they inverted everything familiar. In most traditions, feasting was a reward for harvest, a gesture of gratitude, a reaffirmation of community bonds. In this cult, feasting became a weapon, a tool to dismantle identity and dissolve restraint. It was not about nourishment but annihilation, not about joy but delirium. That inversion, that corruption of something as universal as a meal, is what made these rites unforgettable, even in the fragmented whispers that survive today. The forbidden banquets, then, were more than gatherings of indulgence. They were carefully engineered rituals of excess, designed to blur the line between humanity and divinity, reason and madness, celebration and terror. They remind us that the most ordinary acts, eating, drinking, gathering together, can be twisted into instruments of darkness when guided by obsession and secrecy. And they foreshadowed what was to come. Nights of ecstasy turning into screams, rituals drowning in blood, and the ultimate collapse of a cult that promised transcendence, but delivered only nightmares. Wine has always been more than a drink. Nearly every ancient civilization, it was seen as sacred, a gift of the gods, a bridge between the human and the divine. Shared in ceremonies, poured in offerings, consumed in feasts, wine carried the power to unite communities and dissolve barriers. But for the forgotten cult that turned celebration into nightmare, wine was more than a symbol. It was a weapon. When mixed with herbs and intoxicants, it became the key to ecstasy, a tool to unchain inhibitions, and ultimately, the fuel that drove gatherings into chaos. The cult's obsession with wine was not accidental. It believed intoxication was the pathway to possession. To drink deeply was to abandon reason, to create space for the divine to enter. Sober minds, they claimed, could never commune with gods. Only those who surrendered fully to intoxication could cross the boundary between mortal and immortal. And so, at their gatherings, wine flowed endlessly, poured into goblets, ladles, even straight from large vats, where initiates dunked their cups without pause. It was not moderation, but excess, that marked devotion. But it was not just wine. Chroniclers tell us that these cultic feasts were laced with herbs and substances that heightened their effects. Some plants known for their hallucinogenic properties were ground into powders or brewed into the wine. The combination created visions, sensations, and distortions of reality that participants interpreted as divine encounters. Lights flickered, shadows danced, and in their intoxicated state, initiates believed they saw gods moving among them. The line between hallucination and revelation vanished. The descriptions of these rituals reveal a frightening transformation. At the beginning, the atmosphere resembled a feast. Laughter, music, clinking cups. But as the mixture of wine and substances spread through the gathering, everything changed. Bodies began to move erratically, no longer guided by rhythm, but by convulsion. Voices rose, not in songs, but in frenzied cries. Some collapsed into fits of uncontrollable laughter, others screamed as though pursued by invisible terrors. The banquet dissolved into madness. This chaos, however, was not viewed as disorder by the cult. It was celebrated as the climax of the rite. To lose oneself entirely, to abandon mind, dignity, and control, was considered the ultimate proof of devotion. The leaders of the cult encouraged it, claiming that in these moments of delirium, initiates were possessed by the gods themselves. What outsiders saw as insanity, the cult proclaimed as divine ecstasy. The substances played a crucial role in deepening this experience. Wine on its own could intoxicate, but when combined with hallucinogenic herbs, it created visions so vivid that participants could no longer distinguish reality from imagination. Some claimed to hear the voices of the gods whispering commands. Others swore they saw animals transform into divine beings, or fellow initiates glowing with unearthly light. These visions reinforced the cult's power. Once someone had seen the divine during the ritual, doubt was nearly impossible. The experience, however terrifying, bound them to the cult's authority. But there was a darker side to this forced ecstasy. Overindulgence led to sickness, violent convulsions, and sometimes death. Accounts speak of participants who collapsed during rituals, foaming at the mouth, their bodies unable to withstand the strain of the substances. Others wandered into the night, lost in hallucination, never to return. These tragedies were not seen as failures by the cult, but as sacrifices, proof that the gods had claimed another soul. In this way, every death became a justification, every madness a validation. The wine-fueled ecstasy also created an atmosphere ripe for violence. In the throes of intoxication, participants lost their inhibitions entirely. Acts of cruelty, self-destruction, or uncontrolled aggression erupted without warning. Chant could turn into a scream, a dance into a frenzy of clawing and tearing. The cult's leaders interpreted such outbursts as the will of the gods. In reality, they were the predictable result of minds and bodies broken under the weight of intoxicants. To the authorities of the time, these gatherings represented more than just religious excess. They were a threat to order. Communities depended on restraint, discipline, and clear hierarchies. But within the cult's feasts, all of this disintegrated. In the haze of wine and herbs, participants became unrecognizable even to themselves. The citizen became an initiate. The neighbor became a stranger. The community fractured under the weight of secrecy and madness. The terrifying truth is that the cult weaponized one of humanity's oldest pleasures, drinking together, and twisted it into a tool of domination. The ecstatic visions produced by wine and substances reinforced loyalty, silenced doubt, and bound participants to the cult's grip. The very act of intoxication, which could have been a moment of joy or connection, became the chain that enslaved them. They drank not to celebrate life, but to dissolve it. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is its familiarity. The use of intoxicants to alter consciousness is not unique to this forgotten cult. Throughout history, wine, herbs, and rituals have been used to access what people believed were higher states of being. But here the purpose was not enlightenment or connection, it was control. Ecstasy was weaponized, hallucination turned into proof, and the human body into a theater for forces that thrived on madness. As the nights dragged on, and the cups were emptied and refilled endlessly, what remained was not communion with gods, but exhaustion, degradation, and fear. Participants awoke from the frenzy battered and disoriented, with only fragments of memory. Yet those fragments, the visions, the sensations, the screams, were enough to convince them that they had touched something divine. And once convinced, they returned again and again, slaves to the ritual, captives of a nightmare disguised as celebration. The cult's reliance on wine and intoxicants was not just a ritual choice, it was its identity. Without ecstasy, there was no divinity. Without delirium, there was no proof. But this dependence also sowed the seeds of its destruction. The same substances that bound its members together tore their bodies apart, left them weakened, and fueled rumors that spread through surrounding communities. The image of devotees screaming, hallucinating, or collapsing in frenzied rites became too dangerous to ignore. Authorities eventually moved to suppress the cult, and its banquets of madness were condemned as blasphemy and terror. Yet the memory lingers, even in fragments. The stories that survive remind us of a time when feasts became nightmares, when wine was more than drink, and when ecstasy was not joy but terror. They show us how thin the line is between celebration and destruction, between communion and madness. And they warn us of the dangers that arise when devotion abandons reason and pleasure, becomes the path to ruin. At first, it was the music that defined the cult's gatherings. Flutes, drums, and lyres created an atmosphere of festivity, a rhythm that carried bodies into motion and voices into chorus. In those early moments, the gatherings could almost be mistaken for ordinary celebrations, full of laughter, song, and movement. But as the night deepened and the intoxicants spread through veins, the music took on another quality. It grew louder, harsher, less like celebration and more like incantation.
Wow.
The shift was subtle at first, but soon impossible to ignore. The melodies became commands, the rhythms turned violent, and the chorus of voices transformed into something far darker. It was at this moment between music and screams that the feast crossed its threshold. no longer a banquet but a ritual. The role of music in these rites was deliberate. Ancient peoples always understood the power of rhythm to influence mood, to carry people beyond themselves. The cult weaponized this knowledge. The drumming began slow, steady, mirroring the beat of the human heart. As the night progressed, the rhythm quickened, accelerating the dancers, tightening the chants, until the crowd no longer followed, but was consumed. In that frenzy, the individual ceased to exist. There was no I or you, only the collective body surging to the drumbeat, no longer thinking, only obeying. Wine and intoxicants had already loosened minds, but it was the music that shattered them completely. Flutes shrieked like wailing voices, drums pounded like war, and chants rose in spirals of sound that seemed to come from another world. Some participants collapsed, trembling as though seized by invisible hands. Others screamed in ecstasy or terror, their cries merging with the rhythm until they became indistinguishable from the music itself. What had begun as harmony turned into cacophony. The feast became indistinguishable from a nightmare. Chroniclers who described these rites were divided in their interpretations. Men insisted that the participants were truly possessed, their bodies moving in ways no sober human could endure, their voices carrying tones unrecognizable to ordinary ears. Others dismissed it as hysteria, fueled by intoxication and suggestion. But whether possession or madness, the effect was the same. The music dissolved reason. The participants no longer controlled their movements, their cries, or their thoughts. The ritual consumed them. The transition from feast to ritual was marked not by a single moment, but by a gradual descent into chaos. At first, the music lifted spirits, carrying the intoxicated crowd into laughter and song. But as the pace quickened and the chants grew harsher, the atmosphere shifted. Eyes widened in frenzy, bodies spun wildly, voices broke into screams. The feast hall, once filled with laughter, now echoed with sounds that could only be described as unearthly. It was as though the boundary between the human and the divine had been ripped apart, leaving only delirium in its place. And the cult believed this was the point. For them, the screams were not signs of disorder, but proof of divine presence. To shriek, to convulse, to collapse in exhaustion was to show that the gods had entered. In their twisted theology, pain and terror were as sacred as joy and ecstasy. The louder the cries, the more powerful the possession. The music was not meant to soothe, it was meant to summon. The screams were not accidents, they were offerings. But this belief carried terrifying consequences. In the height of the frenzy, violence erupted. Participants struck each other, clawed at their own flesh, or threw themselves into dangerous contortions. The cult's leaders did not intervene. They claimed such acts were demanded by the gods, that every wound and every shriek was part of the sacred drama. To outside observers, it was madness. To those within, it was holiness. The blending of music and screams was also a tool of control. The leaders directed the rhythm, controlled the pace, guided the chants. They stood at the center of the storm, orchestrating the frenzy with calculated precision. By manipulating sound, they manipulated minds, ensuring that no one could resist the pull of the ritual. The screams of the participants reinforced the cycle. The louder they cried, the more the music intensified, the more the frenzy grew. It was a feedback loop of madness, spiraling deeper into chaos with every beat. The physical toll on participants was immense. Hours of frenzied movement left them collapsed in exhaustion, trembling and drenched in sweat. Voices grew hoarse from screaming, throats torn raw by endless cries. Some fainted, lying unconscious on the ground while others danced around them in delirium. And yet when the ritual ended, survivors described it as transcendence. They believed they had touched the divine, even if their bodies were broken. In this way, the cult ensured loyalty. Suffering itself became proof of salvation. For authorities, however, the sounds of these rituals became unmistakable signs of danger. Reports tell of neighbors hearing the distant echo of drums and cries, carried on the wind from caves or hidden halls. The noises were unlike anything heard in ordinary celebrations. They spoke not of joy but of torment, not of harmony but of chaos. To those outside, it was evidence that something dark and unholy thrived within the cult's feasts. And so the music and screams that bound initiates together, also betrayed them, drawing suspicion and eventually persecution. The transformation of the feast into ritual marked the cult's most terrifying innovation. Where others saw music as art, they used it as weapon. Where others saw screams as suffering, they treated them as offerings. And where others sought joy and celebration, they sought madness. This inversion of meaning turned their gatherings into spectacles of horror, impossible to distinguish from nightmares, yet revered by participants as sacred. The legacy of these rituals is a warning. They show how icily the familiar can be twisted into the terrifying. Music, which can heal, inspire, and unite, was turned into a tool of control. Screams, which normally signal pain or distress, were reframed as sacred. And feasting, which celebrates life, was transformed into ritual chaos. In that distortion lies the true horror of the cult. Not that they invented new forms of terror, but that they corrupted the most ordinary human joys into instruments of madness. Looking back, it is not the instruments of torture or the violence of the frenzy that linger most powerfully. It is the sound, the drumming that quickened like a heartbeat, the flutes that shrieked like voices of the damned, the chants that grew harsher until they became indistinguishable from screams. It was sound that dissolved the feast, that blurred the line between celebration and nightmare, and that turned ordinary gatherings into rituals of terror. Between music and screams, the cult found its identity. And in that space, where rhythm became chaos, where cries became worship, the feast ceased to be human. It became something darker, something unholy, something that even centuries later still echoes as a warning of what happens when celebration is consumed by madness. The feast was never meant to end in harmony. By the time the music blurred into screams and the wine soaked through every breath, the gatherings of the cult had already crossed a threshold where ecstasy gave way to something darker. It was here, in the heart of their hidden halls, that devotion demanded its price. That price was blood. To outsiders, the rumors were always the same: that beneath the songs and banquets, the cult carried out rituals soaked in violence, where offerings were demanded not of food or drink, but of flesh. Chroniclers, often hostile to the group, described scenes where the frenzy reached such intensity that blood was shed as a necessary climax. Whether all accounts are literal truth or shaped by fear and exaggeration, pattern remains undeniable. The cult's rites were not designed to end with joy, but with sacrifice. The blood spilled during these rituals came in many forms. Sometimes it was through acts of self-harm where initiates, overwhelmed by the madness of music, wine, and frenzy, turned their bodies into offerings. Lacerations, gashes, and wounds were interpreted as proof of devotion, as though the gods demanded not only the surrender of the mind, but also of the flesh. Leaders encouraged these displays, declaring that the pain endured was a passage into divinity, a visible mark of loyalty etched into the skin. Other times, the blood came through violence between participants. In the haze of intoxication, tempers flared and blows were exchanged. What might have been condemned as chaos in any other setting was here sanctified as ritual. The gods, the cult claimed, thrived on extremes: joy, pain, passion, rage. To fight and bleed was not disruption, but fulfillment of divine will. Every wound became an offering, every scream another verse in the hymn of possession. And then there were darker whispers still, of sacrifices carried out deliberately, orchestrated by the leaders to seal devotion in its most brutal form. These accounts speak of chosen initiates, sometimes willing, sometimes not, who were brought forth at the height of frenzy. Surrounded by firelight and chant, their blood was spilled to sanctify the night. The act was framed not as murder, but as transcendence, a gift offered to the gods and a bond uniting the group. Whether exaggerated by enemies or grounded in grim reality, such stories reveal how blurred the line between faith and violence had become. The halls themselves bore witness to these practices. Descriptions from ancient sources speak of chambers stained with darkened streaks, floors marked by the traces of countless rituals. These places were not simple feasting halls, but theaters of devotion where the body itself was currency. To enter them was to risk not only your sanity, but your flesh. Every banquet carried the possibility that joy could turn to terror, that laughter could dissolve into a scream, and that the price of belonging might be your own blood. What made these rituals especially terrifying was their unpredictability. Participants never knew how the night would end. Some gatherings might conclude in exhausted collapse, with initiates sprawled across the hall in delirium. Others spiraled into violence, leaving wounds, scars, or worse. The uncertainty was part of the devotion itself. To enter the feast was to surrender entirely, to accept that the gods might demand anything, even the most horrifying of offerings. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors of these gatherings carried not only the physical scars, but also the weight of what they had witnessed. To see blood spilled in the name of faith, to hear the cries of pain framed as sacred, left a mark that could not be erased. Yet for many, this trauma became a bond that tied them even closer to the cult. Shared suffering was reframed as shared salvation. Those who endured it were told they had crossed into a higher state of existence, bound together by blood, terror, and secrecy. For the leaders, this bloodshed was not chaos, but strategy, reinforced control, proving their authority over life and death. By demanding, or allowing blood to be spilled, they established themselves as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. The cult's hierarchy was not maintained by reason or persuasion, but by the fear that at any moment, devotion could be tested in the most extreme way. Blood was power, and those who controlled it ruled the cult absolutely. To the wider society, however, these rumors were intolerable. It was one thing for a sect to feast and dance in secret. It was another to suggest that blood was shed within their halls. Such practices struck fear into the hearts of neighbors, who saw not devotion but corruption, not celebration but horror. Authorities interpreted these rituals as threats to order, proof that the cult was not merely misguided but dangerous. And so, persecution followed, driven by both genuine fear and political necessity. The truth, as always, is complex. Some accounts were undoubtedly exaggerated, shaped by the need to demonize the cult and justify its suppression. Tales of blood sacrifice made for powerful propaganda, but the consistency of the stories, across time and regions, suggests that violence, whether self-inflicted, spontaneous, or orchestrated, was indeed part of the cult's identity. Even if not every rumor was true, enough was rooted in reality to terrify and to ensure the cult's destruction. Looking back, the blood spilled in these rituals reveals the ultimate cost of devotion when faith abandons all restraint. The banquet was never just about food or drink, the music never just about song, the ecstasy never just about joy. All of it pointed toward this climax, the moment when devotion demanded flesh. When the gods were said to feast alongside their worshippers in the most literal, horrifying way, it is this transformation that lingers most powerfully in history. The cult took what should have been symbols of life, feasting, music, wine, and inverted them into instruments of death. The hall, which should have echoed with laughter, instead resounded with screams. The tables, which should have carried nourishment, instead carried offerings of blood. The participants who sought transcendence found themselves trapped in nightmares. And all of it was justified as sacred. The hidden price of devotion, then, was not simply loyalty or secrecy. It was the willingness to surrender everything, body, mind, and life, to a system that devoured its own followers. That is why the cult could not endure. Excess can be hidden for a time, ecstasy excused for a season. But when devotion demands blood, it crosses a threshold from which there is no return. The society around it could not tolerate such practices, and eventually, the cult was stamped out, leaving behind only fragments of rumor and terror. Yet those fragments are enough. They remind us of what happens when devotion becomes obsession, when the sacred is corrupted into violence, and when the most ordinary of human joys, food, music, celebration, are twisted into stages for horror. Doom! The blood in the hall was more than sacrifice. It was the final proof that the cult's promise of transcendence was a lie, that what it offered was not communion with gods, but destruction at the hands of madness. And so the story of the cult's blood-soaked rituals survives not as legend of divinity, but as warning. It shows us the danger of surrendering reason, of cloaking cruelty in faith, of accepting violence as sacred. The halls may have been forgotten, their stones buried and their fires extinguished, but the lesson endures. When devotion demands blood, what begins as celebration always ends in nightmare. History has a way of burying what it cannot explain. Some events are too shameful to preserve, too disturbing to celebrate, and too dangerous to remember. The cult that turned feasts into nightmares falls into this category. Once feared, once whispered about in chronicles and condemned by authorities, it eventually disappeared from public memory. Its halls were abandoned, its rituals extinguished, its name erased, and yet, like all shadows, its presence did not vanish entirely. The cult was forgotten. But its echoes remained, reverberating through myths, legends, and the cultural fear of gatherings that teeter on the edge of madness. The silence of history around this cult was deliberate. Authorities understood that memory can be as dangerous as practice, to allow people to recall the ecstasies, the bloodshed, and the transgressions of its rituals would risk reigniting interest. And so, records were suppressed, writings destroyed, and testimony silenced. Chroniclers who dared to describe the rites often did so in vague language, mixing fact with horror, so that what remained was less history and more rumor. Over time, this vagueness allowed the cult to sink beneath the weight of oblivion, but silence is never complete. In fragments, the cult lived on. Myths of wild gatherings in forests, legends of mysterious halls where screams echoed at night, folk tales of forbidden feasts haunted the collective imagination. The details blurred, but the essence remained. The fear of celebration transforming into chaos, of devotion descending into destruction. These echoes appeared in literature, in plays, in whispered warnings passed down through generations. They survived not as doctrine, but as dread. The very excess of the cult made it unforgettable. Even as the authorities erased names and places, the stories of its rituals were too striking to vanish completely. Who could forget the images of frenzied dances turning into screams? Of wine mixed with herbs that brought visions and madness? Of blood spilled on banquet tables? These were not the kinds of details that history can erase. They lodged themselves into memory, shifting form, but never disappearing. And perhaps this was the cult's true legacy, not the preservation of its teachings or practices, but the haunting impression it left behind. It became less a historical institution and more a symbol of corruption, of how devotion without restraint collapses into madness, how celebration without boundaries dissolves into horror. The cult's silence in the historical record is not absence but warning. It whispers from the margins of history, reminding us of what lies beyond the edges of order. One reason the cult was so easily buried is that it thrived in secrecy to begin with. Unlike great religions that built temples, monuments, and scriptures to preserve themselves, this cult embraced the hidden. Its rituals were held in caves, forests, and remote halls. Its initiates swore oaths of silence. Its knowledge was passed not in books, but in performance. When persecution came, there were no sacred texts to preserve, no stone temples to endure. The cult was designed to vanish, and vanish it did. But secrecy, while it protected them, also ensured their erasure. Yet traces remain, often disguised in unexpected places. Some festivals in later centuries carried echoes of their practices: wild dancing, excessive drinking, masked rites that bordered on chaos. Authorities often cracked down on such events, fearing they resembled too closely the forbidden cult. Even in these diluted forms, the echo persisted. It is possible that some cultural traditions we see today, sanitized and stripped of danger, carry faint shadows of what once was terror. The carnival, the masquerade, the midnight feast, all bear a resemblance to the structure of ritualized chaos. The silence around the cult also raises questions. How much of what we know is true? How much is rumor magnified by fear? Without reliable records, the line between reality and invention is blurred. Perhaps the cult was not as blood-soaked as described. Perhaps the stories of sacrifice and violence were exaggerated by authorities eager to demonize them. Yet the very existence of such stories tells us what mattered, not the precise details, but the collective sense that this cult represented something profoundly dangerous. Whether fact or legend, the image of its gatherings was powerful enough to haunt history. The echoes of the cult also manifest in human psychology. The fear of gatherings turning into chaos, of joy transforming into madness, lingers in us. It is why stories of parties gone wrong, of celebrations ending in violence, resonate so deeply. Somewhere in our cultural memory lies the shadow of those ancient feasts, where music turned to screams and wine turned to blood. We fear them not because we live them, but because they remind us of how thin the line is between order and chaos. In the end, the silence of history is both a burial and a survival. The cult was erased, but its absence became presence. Its forgotten name became a blank space where imagination filled in horrors greater than reality. The forgotten cult became legend precisely because it was silenced. Its disappearance gave it power, transforming it from one sect among many into a timeless warning about the dangers of devotion unchained. What remains most chilling is this: we do not need the cult's exact name or doctrines to understand its message. We remember it through fragments, through whispers, through the fear it left behind. And perhaps this is fitting. The cult thrived on secrecy, on the hidden, on the things left unsaid. In the silence of history, it still thrives, not as a religion, but as a specter. A reminder that even the most joyous of human acts can be twisted into nightmares. So, the story ends, not with clarity, but with echoes. The cult that transformed feasts into horrors is gone, but the unease it created endures. It lives in the fear of excess, in the suspicion of hidden rites, in the stories we tell about celebrations gone wrong. History buried it, but in burying it, history gave it immortality. The silence of history is never empty. It is filled with whispers, shadows, and lessons too terrible to forget. The cult's legacy survives not in temples or scriptures, but in warnings carried forward through time, that joy without restraint becomes madness, that devotion without limit becomes destruction, and that sometimes what disappears from memory does not truly die. It waits, echoing in the spaces where history refuses to speak. From the moment we stepped into the shadows of this forgotten cult, we entered a world where joy was weaponized, where music and wine concealed something monstrous, and where celebration itself became a stage for madness. Piece by piece, the story revealed how rituals disguised as feasts descended into nightmares, until blood was spilled and silence swallowed everything. Now, as we conclude, we must ask, what does this history really tell us? And why do its echoes still reach us centuries later? It began with mystery. The cult's origins were hidden in legend, shrouded by secrecy and bound by oaths that forbade outsiders from ever glimpsing the truth. What seemed harmless, gatherings of food, wine, and music, was anything but. Behind the curtain of joy lay the first corruption, devotion stripped of limits. A religion that preached ecstasy as salvation and indulgence as divine. The earliest stories set the stage for what was to come, a path where humanity and restraint were abandoned in the name of the gods. Then came the feasts. At first glance, they resembled ordinary banquets. Tables filled with roasted meats, fruits, and overflowing wine seemed like any noble celebration. But these were no mere meals. They were rituals of excess, orchestrated to dissolve reason and unleash frenzy. To gorge was to worship, to drink was to transcend, and the secrecy surrounding them only added to their danger. In those hidden halls, laughter blurred into delirium, joy into chaos, and the line between sacred and grotesque vanished. The wine, mixed with herbs and intoxicants, was the engine of madness. With every cup, minds slipped further from reality. Participants claimed visions of gods, hallucinations of light and sound, experiences so vivid that they could not be doubted. Once someone saw the divine, they were bound forever. But these visions came at a cost: sickness, convulsions, even death. What the cult framed as possession was often the body collapsing under poison, and still it was praised as devotion. Wine became blood, ecstasy became terror, and madness became worship. But the true transformation happened when music and screams collided. The steady beat of drums, the shrill cry of flutes, the rising chants, all designed to shatter reason. Rhythm dissolved identity, pulling initiates into a frenzy where screams were no longer cries of suffering but proof of the god's presence. Violence broke out, not condemned but celebrated. Pain and terror were reframed as sacred. In that soundscape of madness, the feast ceased to exist. It became a ritual of possession, a theater of chaos where every note pushed humanity deeper into nightmare. And always there was blood. Sometimes self-inflicted, sometimes erupting between frenzied participants, sometimes orchestrated by leaders in deliberate acts of sacrifice. Blood was the climax, the unspoken truth behind every gathering. The feast was never meant to end with joy. It was designed to end with flesh and screams. In the flicker of torchlight, blood on the floor became the final offering, the ultimate proof that devotion required not only the surrender of mind, but of life itself. Then came silence. Authorities condemned the cult, stamped out its gatherings, erased its name from records. What could not be destroyed was buried beneath rumor and fear. But silence is never empty. The cult's memory survived in whispers. Legends of wild rites in forests, tales of banquets ending in madness, warnings about celebrations that went too far. The details blurred, but the dread remained. In the absence of facts, fear filled the gaps, transforming the cult into a symbol of everything that can go wrong when faith and excess unite. So what is the legacy of this forgotten cult? It is not its doctrines or its gods. Those are long gone. Its legacy is the reminder of how thin the line is between celebration and chaos, devotion and destruction, joy and horror. It shows us how the most ordinary acts, eating, drinking, singing, can be twisted into instruments of control and madness. It reveals how secrecy, intoxication, and manipulation can transform humanity's greatest pleasures into humanity's darkest nightmares. And perhaps that is why we still remember it, even in fragments. Because the story does not feel entirely foreign. We recognize the elements: the feast, the music, the intoxicants, the ecstasy. We know how easily joy can slip into excess, how quickly crowds can lose themselves to frenzy, how dangerous devotion becomes when stripped of restraint. The cult may be forgotten by name, but its echoes live on in our fears, our myths, and our cautionary tales. The silence of history is not protection, it is a whisper. So what it whispers is this: that humanity is always vulnerable to the allure of ecstasy, to the temptation of abandoning reason for rapture, to the promise of transcendence that hides a nightmare beneath its mask. That is the true lesson of the cult. Not simply that it existed, but that it can exist again in any age. Whenever joy is corrupted into madness and devotion into destruction, the story ends then as it began, with a feast. But this feast is not one of food or wine. It is a banquet of memory, laid out before us so that we may taste the bitterness of the past and refuse to repeat it. The cult's halls are silent now, its torches extinguished, its screams faded into the wind. Yet the echoes remain. They warn us that every celebration has its shadow, and that when the music turns to screams, the nightmare has already begun.
History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.